he worked a lot because he didn't prepare his speech before, but he worked all the afternoon. That's, oh my God. Okay. It happens to me when working with my translators to get this question. I feel embarrassed in translating this passage because it sounds ambiguous. It can be read in two different ways. Which was your intention? According to the case, I can answer in three ways. First, that's true. I have chosen the wrong expression. Please eliminate any possible misunderstanding. In the next Italian edition, I do the same. Second, I intentionally wanted to be ambiguous. If you read attentively, you will realize that this ambiguity will have an impact on the further effect of the text. Please do your best to keep the same ambiguity in your language. Third, I didn't realize that I was ambiguous, and honestly, I had no intention to make it so. But as a reader, I find such an ambiguity very intriguing and fruitful for the further course of my text. Please do your best to keep the same effect in your language. Now, if I were dead since many years, a counterfactual conditional which has many chances to become true before the end of this century, my translator, acting as a normal reader and interpreter of my text, could have reached, in any case, one of the following conclusions, which are in fact the same as my possible answers. First conclusion, this ambiguity doesn't make any sense and complicates the further comprehension of this text. Probably the author didn't realize it, but it is better to eliminate it, quandoque bonus dormit Homerus, sometimes even good Homer nods, imagine Umberto Eco. Second, probably the author was intentionally ambiguous, and it is better I respect his or her decision. Third, it's even possible that the author didn't realize to be ambiguous, but from the textual point of view, this effect of uncertainty is rich in connotations and innuendos and looks very fruitful for the whole textual strategy. What I want to say is that those who are called creative writers should never provide interpretations of their own work. A text is a lazy machine that wants its reader to do a part of his job. That is, a device conceived in order to elicit interpretations, as I wrote in The Role of the Reader. When one has a text to question, it is irrelevant to ask the author. At the same time, the reader cannot give any interpretation simply depending on his or her fancies, but must check if the text in some way not only legitimizes but also encourages it. In my book, The Limits of Interpretation, I distinguish between the intention of the author, the intention of the reader, and the intention of the text. In 1962, when I wrote my Opera Aperta, then translated very late in English as the open work, in that book I was advocating the active role of the interpreter in the reading of texts endowed with aesthetic value. When those pages were written, my readers mainly focused the open side of the whole business, underestimating the fact that the open-ended reading I was supporting was an activity elicited by and aiming at interpreting a work. In fact, opera aperta is an oxymoron. An opera, an opus is something close and shouldn't be open. Well, in other words, I was studying the dialectics between the rights of texts and the rights of their interpreters. I have the impression that in the course of the following decades, The rights of the interpreters have been overstressed. In this country, they called it deconstruction. In various of my writings, I elaborate upon the Persian idea of unlimited semiosis, which is unlimited interpretation. But the notion of unlimited semiosis doesn't lead to the conclusion that interpretation has no criteria. First of all, unlimited interpretation concerns systems and not processes. I'll make clear this point. A linguistic system, like English language or Italian language or the Greek language, is a device from which, and by using each, infinite linguistic strings can be produced. If we look in a dictionary for the meaning of a term, we find definitions and synonyms, that is, other words, sometimes even images. And we can go to see what these words mean, so that from their definition we can switch to other words, and so potentially an infinitum. A dictionary is, as Joyce said of Finnegan's Wake, a book written for an ideal reader affected by an ideal insomnia. A good dictionary must be circular. It must say that the word, let's say, cat, means by what the word cat means by means of other words. Otherwise, it would be enough to close the dictionary to point our finger on a cat and say, a cat is that. Very easy, and we have received several times this type of explanation during our childhood. But this is not the way we know the meaning of dinosaur, however, Julius Caesar, or freedom. But a text, insofar it is the result of the manipulation of the possibilities of a system, so English is a system, Hamlet is a text, okay? A text is not open in the same way. In the process of producing a text, one reduces the range of possible linguistic items. If one writes, John is eating a dots, there are strong possibilities that the following word will be a noun, and that this noun cannot be staircase, even though in certain contexts it could be sword. By reducing the possibility of producing infinite strings, a text also reduces the possibility of trying certain interpretations. In the dictionary, the pronoun I still means whoever is uttering the sentence in which I appears. And therefore, according to the raw possibilities offered by a dictionary, I can be President Bush, Bin Laden, Groucho Marx, Nicole Kidman, as well as billions of other individuals of the present, past, and future world. But in a letter signed with my name, I means Umberto Eco, irrespective of what Derrida can have objected to Searle in the course of a famous debate on signature and context. To say that the interpretations of a text are potentially unlimited doesn't mean that interpretation has no object. To say that a text has potentially no end doesn't mean that every act of interpretation can have a happy end. This is why in The Limits of Interpretation, I have proposed a sort of Popper-like criterion of falsification by which, if it is difficult to decide if a given interpretation is a good one, and which one between two different interpretations of the same text is better, it's always possible to recognize when a given interpretation is blatantly wrong, crazy, and far-fetched. Some contemporary theories of criticism assert that the only reliable reading of a text is a misreading, that the only existence of a text is given by the chains of the responses it elicits. But this chain of responses represents the infinite uses we can make of a text. We can even use a Bible instead of a piece of wood in our fireplace, or to beat on the head of somebody else. That is the use of a text. But not the series of interpretation which depend on some acceptable conjectures about the intentions of a text. How to prove that a conjecture about the intention of a text is acceptable? The only way is to check it upon the text as a coherent whole. And this is a very old idea. It comes from St. Augustine in the Doctrina Christiana, in which he was speaking of the most terrible and important text of this world, the sacred scriptures. Any interpretation given of a certain portion of a text can be accepted if it is confirmed, and must be rejected if it is challenged by another portion of the same text. In this sense, the internal textual coherence controls the otherwise uncontrollable drives of the reader. Let me make an example which concerns one of the texts that intentionally and programmatically encouraged the most daring interpretation. I mean, Finnegan's Wake by Joyce. In the 60s, a journal that was published at that time, a Wake newsletter, published a discussion about possible references to recent history that could be identified in Finnegan's Wake. For instance, a reference to the German-Austrian Anschluss and the Munich Pact of September. In order to challenge this interpretation, a scholar, Nathan Halper, suggested that the word Anschluss has also customary a non-political sense, like connection and inclusion. If you go in a German airport, you will see a lot of Anschluss here and there, flight connection. And so he tried to demonstrate that the political reading was not necessarily supported by the context. To show how easy it could be to find everything in Finnegan's Wake, Nathan Halper took the example of Beria. First of all, he found at the beginning of the tale of the Hound and the Grasshopper, a part of Finnegan's Wake, the expression "so be it," and thinks that it can be related to the quasi-communist ant society, because it is the tale of the ant or ant and the grass or grasshopper. But it has been suspected that this was a reference to the Soviet minister, and one page later there is an allusion to a burial, B-E-R-E-A-L. At the first glance, a variant of burial, B-U-R-I-L. But it has been suspected that this was a reference to the Soviet minister Lavrenti Beria. Not unthinkable, except that Beria was not known in the Western world before December 9, 1938, when he was named Commissar of Internal Affairs, and before he was merely a minor functionary. And in December 1938, Joyce's manuscript was already at the printers. Moreover, a reference to Beria was present in a 1929 version of that chapter published in Transition 12. And so far, far before Beria was known, probably even by Stalin. The question seems to be settled on the grounds of external proofs in this case. Beria was unknown before 1938. Even though it seems that, according to some interpreters, that Joyce had the prophetic power and was so able to foretell the Beria's ascent to power, but very ludicrous indeed, but among Joyce's fans you can find more than that. More interesting are the internal proofs, textual ones. In the following issue of the same journal, Ruth von Poole reveals that "so be it" could also be intended as a form of "amen" given by members of authoritarian religious beliefs and bodies. And that the general context of these pages was not political, but rather biblical. And the Ond says, as broad as Beppi's realm shall flourish, my reign shall flourish. And that Beppi is the Italian diminutive of Joseph, and Beria is a suppressed allusion to that Joseph who was twice figuratively buried in the pit and in the prison. And Joseph begot Ephraim, who in its turn begot Beria. And Joseph's brother Asher had a son called Beria, and so on and so forth. Probably many of the allusions found by Fonpoul are far-fetched, but it seems undeniable that all the references of these pages are of a biblical character. The textual proofs, too, excludes Laurenti Beria from the Joycean opus, and St. Augustine would have agreed, and even Stalin agreed, because later he sent Beria to the firing squad, and that was definitely settled. The model reader of a story is not the empirical reader. The empirical reader is you, me, anyone, when we read a text. Empirical readers can read in many ways, and there is no law which tells them how to read, because they often use the text as a container for their own passions, which may come from outside the text, or which the text may arouse by chance. There are infinite uses, as I said, of the text. Let me mention a funny situation in which one of my readers has acted as an empirical and not as the model reader. The model reader is the one the text wants to interpret it in a way. An old childhood friend of mine, whom I hadn't seen for years, wrote to me after the publication of my second novel, Foucault's Pendulum. Dear Umberto, I do not recall having told you the pathetic story of my uncle and my aunt, but I think you were very indiscreet to use it in your novel. Well, in my book, I recount a few episodes concerning a certain Uncle Charles and an Aunt Catherine, who in the story are the uncle and aunt of the protagonist, Jacopo Belbo. And it is true that these characters really did exist with few alterations. I told the story from my childhood concerning an uncle and an aunt who had, however, different names. I answered my friend saying that Uncle Charles and Aunt Catherine were my relations, not his own. Therefore, I had the copyright, and that I was not even aware that he had had any uncle or aunt. It looked to me an uncle-less creature. My friend apologized. Okay, he said that he had been so absorbed by the story that he thought he could recognize some events that had happened to his uncle and aunt, which is not impossible because in wartime, as was the period in which my memories went back, similar things happens to different uncles and aunts. What had happened to my friend? He had sought in my story something that was instead in his private memory. He was not interpreting my text, but rather using it. It is not forbidden at all to use a text for daydreaming, and we do it frequently, but this is not a public affair. This means to move within a text as if it were our own private journal. On the contrary, I now mention some cases in which, as an empirical author, I had to surrender in face of a reader who was sticking to the intention of my text. Another was entitled, his book, The Name of the Rose Must Be Ready to Face Manifold Interpretations of this title. Even many that found a similarity with the Shakespearean A Rose by Any Other Name, which means exactly the contrary of the final verse of my book, because the final verse says that everything disappears and only name survives, while Shakespeare says that independently of the names, a rose is always a rose. So Shakespeare was on the side of Gertrude Stein, not on my side. So, as an empirical author, I chose that title just in order to set the reader free. And I wrote in my reflection on the name of the rose, or postscript of the name of the rose, because in Great Britain and in America it had two different titles. I don't know why. I wrote, the rose is a figure so rich in meanings that by now it has any meaning left. Dante's mystic rose, and go lovely rose, the wars of the roses, rose thou art sick, too many rings around rosy, a rose by any other name, a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, the Rosicrucians, and so on and so forth. Moreover, someone has discovered that some early manuscript of De Contemptu Mundi of Bernard of Morlaix, from which I borrowed the hexameter Stat Rosa Pristina nomina nuda tenemus, which closes my novel, some of the manuscript read Stat Roma Pristina nomine, which after all seems more coherent with the rest of the poem, which speaks of the lost Babylonia on the lost kingdom. Later, a Latinist told me that is impossible, because the O of Rome is long, while the O of Rosa is short, and only with Rosa the initial dactyl of the hexameter would work properly. So it was Rose and not Rome. But if by chance I came across to that older version, my book would have been the name of Rome, so acquiring fascist overtones, I don't know, or looking like a technicolor about Ben-Hur and things like that. But the text reads the name of the rose, and I understand now how difficult it was to stop the infinite series of connotations that that word elicits. Probably I wanted to open the possible readings so much as to make each of them irrelevant, and as a result I have produced an inexorable series of interpretations. Then I cannot stop. But the text is there, and the empirical author has to remain silent. I called Casaubon one of the main characters of my Foucault's pendulum, and I was thinking of Isaac Casaubon, who, in the 17th century, demonstrated that the Corpus Hermeticum was a forgery. And if one reads Foucault's pendulum, one can find some analogy between what the great philologist understood and what my characters finally understand. I was aware that few readers would have been able to catch the allusion, but I have spoken yesterday of the double coding technique. Well, some of them would, some of them wouldn't. I was equally aware that in terms of textual strategy, it was not indispensable to know that my Casaubon was linked to Isaac Casaubon. Many authors like to put in their texts certain shibboleths for few smart readers. But before finishing my novel, I discovered by chance that Casaubon was also a character of Middlemarch, a book that I had read but decades before, so I had completely forgotten. That was a case in which, as a model author, I made an effort in order to eliminate any possible reference to George Eliot. And so, at a certain point in my story, one can read this exchange between Belbo and Casaubon. By the way, what's your name? Casaubon. Casaubon. Wasn't a character in Middlemarch? I don't know. There was also a Renaissance philologist by that name, but we are not related. Stop. I eliminate. I did my best to avoid what I thought to be a useless reference to Marianne Evans. But then a smart reader, David Robbie, remarked that Helios Casaubon was writing a key to all mythologies. As a modern reader, I feel obliged to accept that innuendo. Text plus encyclopedical knowledge entitle any cultivated reader to find that connection. It makes sense. Too bad for the empirical author who was not as smart as his readers. In the same vein, my novel is entitled Foucault's Pendulum because the pendulum I am speaking of was invented by Léon Foucault. If it were invented by Franklin, who invented so many things, the title would have been Franklin's Pendulum. This time I was aware from the very beginning that somebody could have smelled an allusion to Michel Foucault. My characters are obsessed by analogies, and Foucault wrote on the paradigm of similarity. As an empirical author, I was not so happy of such a possible connection. It sounds as a joke, and not a clever one, indeed. But the pendulum was invented by Léon, and the pendulum was the hero of my story, and I couldn't change the title. Too bad for Franklin. But thus, I hoped my modern reader would not have tried a superficial connection with Michel Foucault. I was wrong. Many smart readers did it. The text is there. Maybe they are right. Maybe I am responsible for a superficial joke. Maybe the joke is not that superficial. I don't know. The whole affair is by now out of my control. Now let me consider cases in which, even if I had forgotten my initial intentions, acting as a modern reader and checking on the text, I think to have the right, as every other human being, to refuse interpretations that do not look economical, that is, which do not increase the comprehension and the enjoyment of a given text, or cannot be supported by the context. Yelena Kostyukovich, before translating into Russian, and masterfully, as all the other my novel, The Name of the Rose, wrote a long essay on it. And taken by the demon of association of ideas, she remarked that there exists a book by Émile Henriot, La Rose de Bratislava, 1946, where it can be found a hunting of a mysterious manuscript and the final fire of a library. The story takes place in Prague, and at the beginning of my novel I mention Prague. Moreover, one of my librarians is named Berengar, and one of the librarians of Henriot was named Bernard Mar. I had never read Henriot's novel, and I ignored that it, the novel, and he, the author, existed. I have read many interpretations in which my critics found out sources of which I was fully aware, and I was very happy that they so cunningly discovered what I so cunningly concealed in order to lead them to find it. For instance, the model for the couple Serenus Zeitblom Adrian in Mann's Dr. Faustus was very important for the narrative relationship Azzo-Williams in The Name of the Rose. I have read of sources totally unknown to me, and I was delighted that somebody believed that I was eruditely quoting them. Once a young medievalist told me that a blind librarian was mentioned in the 6th century AD by Cassiodorus. I have read critical analysis in which the interpreter discovered the influence of which I was unaware when writing, but I certainly had read those books in my youth, and I understood that I was unconsciously influenced by them. For instance, my friend Giorgio Celli said that among my remote readings there should have been the novels of Dmitry Merezkovsky. Okay, I recognize that it was true, even though I read them at the age of 12. So, in spite of all this, As an uncommitted reader of my own novel, I think that the argument of Jelena Kostukovic is not proving anything interesting. The research of a mysterious manuscript and the fire of a library are very common literary topoi, and I could quote many other books which use them. A novel on Middle Ages in which either a cathedral or a library bursts out is like a movie on the Pacific War in which an airplane falls down. That's normal. They did it every moment. Prague was mentioned at the beginning of my story, but if instead of Prague I mentioned Budapest, it would have been the same. Prague doesn't play a crucial role on my story. Finally, Berengar and Bergard can be a coincidence. But Jelena Kostukovic wrote something more to prove the analogy between me and Henriot. She was not speaking of plagiarism. She only wanted to show that there are analogies between books. She said that in the Henriot novel, the coveted manuscript was the original copy of the Memories of Casanova. It happens that in my novel there is a minor character called Hugh of Newcastle, and the Italian version Ugo di Novocastro. The conclusion of Kostukovic is that only by passing from a name to another it is possible to conceive of the name of the rose. As an empirical author, I could say that Hugh of Newcastle is not an invention of mine, but a historical figure mentioned in the medieval sources. The episode of the meeting between the Franciscan legation and the papal representative literally quotes a medieval chronicle of the 14th century, but the reader has not the duty to know that, and my reaction cannot be taken into account. However, I think to have the right to state my opinion as an uncommitted reader. First of all, Newcastle is not a translation of Casanova, which should be translated as a new house. Besides, etymologically speaking, the Latin meaning of Novocastro is new city or new encampment. Thus, Newcastle suggests Casanova in the same way it could suggest Newton. But there are other elements that can textually prove that that hypothesis is uneconomic. First of all, Hugh of Newcastle shows up in the novel playing a very marginal role and has nothing to do with the library. If the text wanted to suggest a pertinent relationship between Hugh and the library, as well as between him and the manuscript, it should have said something more. But the text doesn't say a word about that. Secondly, Casanova was, at least on the light of a common shared encyclopedical knowledge, a professional lover and a rake, and there is nothing in the novel which casts in doubt the virtue of Hugh. Third, there is no evident connection between a manuscript of Casanova and the manuscript of Aristotle. And there is nothing in the novel which alludes to a sexual incontinence as a value to be pursued. As a model reader of my own novel, I feel entitled to say that to look for the Casanova connection doesn't lead anywhere, and it is the same as to look for the Anschluss connection in Joyce. Once during a debate, a reader asked me what I meant by the sentence, "The supreme happiness lies in having what you have." I felt disconcerted, and I guaranteed that I had never written that sentence. I was sure of it, and for many reasons. First, I do not think that happiness lies in having what one has. Not even Snoopy would subscribe such a triviality. Secondly, it is improbable that a medieval character would suppose that happiness lied in having what he actually had, since happiness for the medieval mind was a future state to be reached through present suffering. Thus, I repeated that I had never written that line, and my interlocutor looked at me as I were unable to recognize what I had written. Later, I came across that quotation. I wrote it. It appears during the description of the erotic ecstasy of Azzo in the kitchen. This episode, as the dullest of my readers can easily guess, is entirely made up with quotation from the Song of Songs and from medieval mystics. In any case, even though the reader doesn't find out all the sources, he or she can guess that these pages depict the feelings of a young man after his first and certainly last sexual experience. If one goes to reread the line in its context, I mean the context of my text, not necessarily the context of its medieval sources, one finds that the line reads, "O Lord, when the soul is transported, the only virtue lies in having what you see. The supreme happiness is having what you have." Thus, happiness lies in having what you have, not in general and not in every moment of your life, but only in the moment of the ecstatic vision. This is the case in which it is unnecessary to know the intention of the empirical author. The intention of the text is blatant, and if English words have a conventional meaning, the text doesn't say what the reader, obeying to some idiosyncratic drives, believed to have read. Between the unattainable intention of the author and the arguable intention of the reader, there is the transparent intention of the text, which disproves an untenable interpretation. My late friend, Josue Musca, wrote a critical analysis of my pendulum that I consider among the best I read. But from the beginning, he confessed, however, to have been corrupted by the habit of my characters and goes fishing for analogies. He masterfully isolates many ultraviolet quotations and stylistic analogies I wanted to be discovered. He finds other connections I didn't think of, but that look very persuasive. And he plays the role of a paranoiac reader by finding out connections that amaze me, but that I am unable to disprove, even though I know that they can mislead by the reader. For instance, it seems that the name of the computer, Abulafia, plus the name of the three main characters, Belbo, Casobon, and Diotalevi, produces the series ABCD. Useless to say that until the end of my work I gave the computer a different name. My readers can object that I unconsciously changed it just in order to obtain an alphabetic series. According to Josue Musca, it seems that Jacopo Belbo is fond of whiskey, okay, and his initial make J and B. Useless to say that until the end of my work, his first name was not Jacopo but Stefano, and that I changed it into Jacopo at the last moment. The only real objection I can make as a modern reader of my book is that the alphabetical series ABCD is textually irrelevant if the names of the other characters do not bring it until X, Y, and Z. Second, Belbo doesn't drink also whiskey, but also martini. And furthermore, his mild alcoholic addition is not the most relevant of his features. On the contrary, I cannot disprove my reader when he also remarked that Cesare Pavese, a writer whom I loved and I love very much, was born in a village called Santo Stefano Belbo, and that my Belbo, a melancholic Piedmontese, can recall Pavese. As a matter of fact, even though my model reader is not supposed to know this detail, I spent my childhood on the banks of the river Belbo, where I underwent some of the ordeals that I attributed to Jacopo Belbo. And that happened a long time before I was informed of the existence of Cesare Pavese. So it's like Aunt Catherine and Uncle Charles. They are my copyright, not necessarily the copyright of Pavese. But I was aware of the fact that people could have made an immediate connection. That's why I changed the name of my character. Instead of Stefano Belbo, I called him Jacopo Belbo in order to make the connection with Pavese a little less perceptible. But this was not enough, and my reader was right in finding a connection between Pavese and Jacopo Belbo. Probably it would be right even if I called Belbo by any other name. I could keep going with examples of this sort, and I have chosen only those that were more immediately comprehensible and maybe more superficial. I skipped all the more complex cases because I risked to engage too much myself upon matters of philosophical or aesthetical interpretation. And I hope my readers will agree that I have introduced empirical author in this game only in order to stress its irrelevance and to reassert the rights of the text. But at the end of my speech, I feel, however, the impression to have been scarcely generous with the empirical author. There is at least a case in which the witness of the empirical author requires an important function, not so much in order to better understand his texts, but certainly in order to understand the unpredictable maneuvers of every creative process. To understand the creative process also means to understand how certain textual solutions come to being by serendipity or as the result of unconscious mechanism. This helps to understand the difference between the textual strategy as a linguistic object that model readers have under their eyes so that they can go on independently of the empirical author's intentions, and the story of the growth of that textual strategy. Some of the examples I have made can work in this direction. Let me add now two other curious examples which have a privilege. They really concern only my personal life and do not have any detectable textual counterpart. They have nothing to do with the business of interpretation. They can only tell how a text, which is a machine conceived in order to elicit interpretations, sometimes grows out of a magmatic territory which has nothing or not yet to do with literature. First story. In Foucault's Pendulum, the young Casaubon is in love with a Brazilian girl called Amparo. Josué Musca, the critic I quoted before, found, but tongue-in-cheek, a connection with Ampere, who studied the magnetic force between two currents. Too smart. I didn't know why I chose that name, Amparo. I realized that it was not a Brazilian name, so that I was pulled to write at a certain moment. I never did understand how it was that Amparo, a descendant of Dutch settlers in Recife who intermarried with Indians and Sudanese blacks, with her Jamaican face and Parisian culture, had wound up with a Spanish name. This means that I took the name Amparo as it came from outside the novel, and I was obliged to accept it. After the publication of the novel, a friend asked me, why Amparo? Is not the name of a mountain or of a girl who looks at the mountain? And then he explained, there is that song, Guaira Guantanamera, which mentions Monte Amparo. Oh my God. I knew very well that song, even though I didn't remember a single word of it. It was sung in the mid-50s by a girl with which I was in love at the time. She was Latin American, and very beautiful also. She was not Brazilian, like my Amparo, not Marxist, like my Amparo, not black, not hysterical, as Amparo is, but it is clear that when inventing a Latin American charming girl, I unconsciously thought of that older image of my youth when I had the same age of Casabon. I thought of that song, and in some way the name Amparo, that I had completely forgot, transmigrated from my unconscious to the page. This story, as you see, is fully irrelevant for the interpretation of my text. As far as the text is concerned, Amparo is Amparo is Amparo is Amparo. Second story. Those who have read my Name of the Rose know that there is a mysterious manuscript, that it contains the last second book of Aristotle's Poetics, that its pages are smeared with poison, and that at a certain moment it is described, the book is described like this. He read the first page aloud and stopped as if he were not interested in knowing more, and rapidly lifted through the following pages. But after a few pages he encountered resistance, because near the upper corner of the side edge and along the top, some pages had stuck together, as happens when the damp is deteriorating papery substance and forms a kind of sticky paste. I wrote these lines at the end of 79. In the following years, at the end, yes, of 79. In the following years, perhaps also because after the Name of the Rose I started to be more frequently in touch with librarians and book collectors, and certainly because I had a little more money at my disposal, I became a regular rare books collector. It had happened before in the course of my life that I bought some old book, but by chance, and only when they were very cheap. Only in the course of the last 25 years I have become a serious book collector. And serious means that one has to consult specialized catalogs and must write for every book a technical file with a collation, historical information of the previous or following editions, and a precise description of the physical state of the copy. This last job requires a technical jargon in order to precisely name foxed brown, water-stained, soiled, washed or crisp leaves, cropped margins, erasures, rebaked bindings, rubbed joints, and so on and so forth. One day, rummaging through the upper shelves of my home library, I discovered an edition of the Poetics of Aristotle, commented by Antonio Riccoboni, Padova, 1587. I had forgot to have it, and I found on the end paper an 1,000 written in pencil. This means that I bought it somewhere for 1,000 lirs. Today they would be 70 cents of a dollar. Probably in the 50s, some bouquinist, and it was so cheap because, well, the binding was practically destroyed. My catalogs said that it was the second edition, not exceedingly rare, that there is a copy of it at the British Museum, but I was happy to have it because it seems difficult to find, and in any case the commentary of Riccoboni is less known and less quoted than those, let's say, of Robortello or Castelvetro. Then I started writing my description to make a good file. I copied the title page, and I discovered that the edition had an appendix, a Usdem Ars Comica ex Aristotele. This means that Riccoboni tried to reconstruct the lost second book of the Poetics. It was not, however, an unusual endeavor. They started from the Byzantine time to do these efforts. And they went on to set up the physical description of the copy. And then it happened to me what happened to a certain Zatesky, described by Alexander Luria, the Russian neurologist. This Zatesky, having lost part of his brain during the war, and with part of the brain the whole of his memory and of his speaking ability, was nevertheless still able to write. Thus, automatically, his hand wrote down all the information he was unable to think of, and step by step he reconstructed his own identity by reading what he was writing. It's a marvelous little book that inspired also in part my Queen Loana novel. Likewise, I was looking coldly and technically at the book, writing my description, and suddenly I realized that I was rewriting the name of the rose. The only difference was that from page 120, when the ars comica begins, the lower and not the upper margins were severely damaged, but all the rest was the same. The pages progressively browned and damp-stained, at the end stuck together, and look as if they were smeared with a disgusting substance. I had in my hands, in printed form, the manuscript I described in my novel. I had had it for years and years at my reach at home. It was not an extraordinary coincidence and not even a miracle. Probably I bought that book in my youth. I skimmed through it. I realized that it was exaggeratedly soiled. I put it somewhere and I forgot it. But by a sort of internal camera, I photographed those pages. And for decades, the image of those poisonous leaves lied in the most remote part of my soul, as in a grave, until the moment it emerged again, I do not know for which reasons, and I believe to have invented it. This story, too, like the one of Amparo, has nothing to do with a possible interpretation of my book. If it has a moral, it is that the private life of the empirical authors is, under a certain respect, more unfathomable than their texts. Between the mysterious history of a textual production and the uncontrollable drift of its future readings, the text, qua text, still represents a comfortable presence, the point to which we can stick. Thank you.